Hello and good morning, Cisco Networking Academy instructors taking the Python Programmability Initiative course. In this video tutorial, we're going to be circling back to take another more in-depth look at the JavaScript object notation, or as it's better known, simply JSON. We're going to try to eliminate a number of the mistakes and typos that were made in order to provide you with a bit more continuity and a bit more information around JSON and what it's all about. And we're going to be doing all of this through the lens of the Python programming language. So, where do we start? Well, JSON was created by Douglas Crockford in 2001. And here is the JSON homepage. It's simply json.org. Now, on this homepage, you'll find on the main page a number of examples of the different types of structures that JSON supports. And we're going to be talking about the object, we're going to be talking about the array, we're going to be looking at strings, numbers, Booleans, the null value, and we're going to be talking about a number of the semantics around JSON. So, JSON is actually defined in an RFC. Now, there were a number of initial RFCs, 4627, and now we're here at 8259. And so this is the current RFC, and as you can see, there is also a draft that is in the works, or this is from the draft that was in the works, RFC 7159. So this RFC obsoletes 7159, so 8259 is the RFC that I would highly recommend that you take a look at. A lot of individuals don't know that JSON is a standard, and the RFC document contains, down in the introduction area, it's going to contain a lot of very, very good information about JSON and about the different types of primitives that JSON supports. So I would highly recommend taking a look at the RFC. Now, what is JSON? Well, JSON is a text format for serialized data. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, remember, in the programmable web, we need a common denominator, a vendor-agnostic, vendor-independent way to exchange data. And JSON is one of the ways to do that. Now, as we've seen when we looked at MapQuest and the MapQuest API, you noticed that there's also another data interchange format, and that's XML. However, one of the challenges with XML is the fact that everything in XML is tagged, even down to the number 0, right? So all of these tags make it not only more difficult to look at and read and interpret the XML data, but it just simply makes it very, very difficult to parse and handle with whatever programming language you might be using, which is why JSON is gaining more and more ground all the time because of its vendor agnostic nature. Again, XML is also vendor agnostic, but it's easy to read and it's non-proprietary. And again, XML is not proprietary either, but I'm just simply pointing out that JSON has a lot of advantages, and the most important is how easy it is to read. Now, when we talk about data interchange format, right? You may hear like a data exchange or data format, and JSON is all of those things. But when we think about data interchange format, think of it like this in the terms of the programmable web, where I talked about that common denominator that systems need to exchange data. And interchange, if we think of it in the OSPF, or the Open Shortest Path First Routing Protocol context, where you have intra-area routes, and those are routes that are all within the same area, but then you have inter-area routes, or routes that go between the areas, but they're still understood even though they're traveling or being advertised, propagated into different areas. And that's interchange, which is data from one system, one area, going to another system in another area. And we need a way to understand that data. And JSON is a language that provides that data interchange reliability that we have. Now, one question that learners often ask is, do I need to know JavaScript in order to understand JSON. And so while it might help to know JavaScript or to have seen JavaScript, I will also be showing you some examples of where knowing JavaScript may be a hindrance to understanding the grammar or the syntax of JSON. And as we've said, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And one of the key takeaways is the idea that JSON is mutually exclusive from JavaScript. When we say JavaScript Object Notation, the object portion of the JSON name is that it is derived from or borrowed or decided to use the object literals of JavaScript, like an object, like an array, like a string. However, there are little semantics that we'll be showing here that show you why it's a little bit different. But again, JavaScript Object Notation, JSON, the name is just simply indicating that the format, the syntax of it, has been derived or borrowed from those object literals that you find in JavaScript. So we've got a number of different primitives that are supported. And if I was to come over to Adobe Brackets. Now, I'm simply using this as a text editor. I've saved this file off as just JSON demo file with today's date and a .json at the end of the name. And so let's go ahead and start with objects. Right? Now, an object in JSON will look very similar to an object in JavaScript for those of you that are familiar with JavaScript. However, there are some slight differences. We begin with the curly brace. And that right there, even though it's empty, could be considered a JSON object. However, it's pretty much useless because we don't have any data in it. So let's go ahead and build out a JSON object. Now, one of the things that we need to remember with JSON and the difference between JSON and JavaScript is when we have our objects, which are going to be comprised of name value pairs. Now, there's many different ways you'll hear this said. You might hear key value pairs because when we transition to Python, and we consume or deserialize that JSON data, we're going to be receiving and interpreting that data to be a key value pair, just like a Python dictionary. And objects in JSON, in other words, what we're going to be putting in between the curly braces here is unordered, just like it's unordered in Python. And I'm going to put a little asterisk right there on the last half of that statement. Remember that in Python after version 3.6, there is an order to how things are listed in the dictionary. It's in the order that they are entered. However, when I'm saying unordered, I'm saying that we're not accessing it based on some ordinal or numeric position, like first item entered 0, like we would in a list. So again, going forward, if I use the term unordered, it's understanding that in Python, yes, there is this order, and it's based on how things are entered in. In JSON, again, it's just simply unordered, like a Python dictionary, as we're going to be putting in key value or name value pairs. Now, one of the first things that we need to recognize is that on the left-hand side of the colon, and the colon separates your key value pairs, your keys or your name must be inside double quotes. And this is one of the differences that you'll find between JavaScript and JSON. In JavaScript, we can get away with either single quotes or double quotes, and you can even get away with no quotes on the left-hand side of the colon. And I'll just simply say my key value, right? So here's my key, and this is going to be separated by some kind of a value. So on the left-hand side of the colon, we have the key. On the right-hand side of the colon, we have the value. And if we want to look at it in JSON terminology, and it's interchangeable, and I'll use it interchangeably, we could say that the name is on the left-hand side in the double quotes, and the value is on the right-hand side. Now, what can the value be? Well, it could be another object. So if it was another object, I could throw curly braces in here, and it could even be an empty object. It could be another string. And so if I was to go ahead and say, we'll say my value. And let me go ahead and, for completeness, make sure we've got that in there. It could be a string that says my value. It could be a number. And in JSON, unlike other programming languages, there is no need to declare a number or an int or a float or an exponent. We're using all of those as simply numbers. So I could say 99, or I could say 3.14. Again, JSON is going to treat those as simply numbers. They could be positive, they could be negative. And so that is the value side of that key value pair. Now, let's go ahead and I'm going to introduce you to JSON lint. And this is something that we looked at on Thursday evening. And so if I was to copy this very simple JSON object, and it's an object because it's got the curly braces, and let's go back to our browser and let's take a look at JSON lint, where I can actually paste in JSON data and validate that that is in fact valid JSON. Now, don't take my word for it that the single quote will not work here. Again, this is JSON. It's not Python and it's not JavaScript, where we can get away with the single quotes. In JSON, we're going to come up with a parser error. Now, I also commented that you might see something like this, where the key on the left-hand side of the colon has no double quotes around it. Now, this is not valid JSON. However, this might work for you in JavaScript. And so there are two instances right there where knowing JavaScript could cause short-term confusion, because you may think, oh, well, I can just put single quotes around this key value or around the key name, and I'm going to be good around the string that is the key name. And you may think, well, maybe I can just leave it off. Well, you can't. It's got to be double quotes just like this. Now, with the key, it has to be a string. It cannot be one of the other primitive data types. So what I'm saying is, what if I wanted to try to order things by saying that I'm just going to go ahead and make this 0? And let's go to validate it, and you can see it won't validate. So we can't use a number there. Could I use an array here? And the answer is no. We're going to end up with the same problem. It must be a string, and in JSON, that string must be enclosed inside of double quotes. Now, could I do this? I absolutely can, because what I'm telling JSON here, and let's validate to see that that is in fact valid JSON, but this 0 has no numerical value. It is a string literal. It is literally the character 0. That is it. There is no numeric value here. But this is just to show you that we must have double quotes around the name in the name value pair, and we must make sure, that it's not single quotes. All right, so we transition back here to our object. And so back here with our JSON object in Adobe brackets, we can have more than one name value pair. In fact, that's the actual value or the value proposition for an object, or in Python, we would look at that as a dictionary. And so let's go ahead and add some things in here. So I'm going to put a comma, because commas separate the key value pairs, or those name value pairs. So the name of this will be my cool array. And let's go ahead and put the value in as just simply an array that is 1, 2, 3. And again, we now have another name value pair. Let's separate with a comma from the next name value pair. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say routers. And that's going to be the name or the key, and the value is going to be what we refer to as a nested object or a nested dictionary, where the value for the name routers is in fact another object. And in that object, I can put in here ISR G2 routers maybe. And we can have another value in here. And maybe that value is going to be a string that says 3900, and let's just do this, 2900 and then 1900. Right? So we're just listing out ISR G2 routers. But again, you see that we can actually nest objects within objects, or in Python terminology, we can nest dictionaries inside of dictionaries as long as we have this key value pair. And so let's go ahead and grab all of this, which appears to be correct in terms of JSON, and let's come back over here and let's wipe out what we had here, and let's paste in this new bit of JSON data, and let's see if it validates. And take a look at that. Worked beautifully. And it also changes the layout for us. And I like how it changes the layout, because what we could do is from here, I can go ahead and copy this. And if I was to open up idle, I could slide this to the side and simply say D for dictionary, and then paste that information in. And so now in Python, I have taken that JSON data, cut and pasted it into the interactive interpreter, and assigned the variable name, just lowercase d, to represent or reference this information. So we can now do all of the Pythonic things that we would do to a dictionary. We could check and see, all right, well, what's the ID? Where in memory does this object reside, this dictionary object in Python? Because now that we've consumed it, it's no longer, I mean, it's still JSON data, but we're treating it, right? Think of it as like typecasting. I'm going to come back to that when we talk about the Boolean values that you see in JSON. And again, semantics around, does the true and false have to be all uppercase? Does it have to be all lowercase? Does it have to start with a capital T or a capital F? And we'll talk about that in a second. But I want you to think of that, right? We're consuming this JSON data that we just created. And now, since we're in Python, we treat it as a Python dictionary. It's that seamless integration between Python and consuming the JSON data that makes Python so attractive when it comes to a programming language that you can use to parse, manipulate, and work with that JSON data. So I could also do the following. And remember, we access the values based on the keys. So if I said my key value, there is from the dictionary the key, my key value, and that's the value. Now, you'll also notice something else. What happened to all of those double quotes? They're gone. And they've been replaced with single quotes, because remember, in Python, we can use double quotes for key values that are strings, and we can use single quotes to enclose our key values that are strings. And so what's happened is, think of it as, again, like typecasting. When we consumed this information here, Python basically casted all the double quotes to single quotes. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if I was to replay that previous command using a single quote a single quote for opening and closing that string, we're going to get the same value back. And so these are little semantics to be aware of that you'll see with the behavior once you have consumed that JSON data into Python, whether it's the interactive interpreter or through your script. All right, so this, again, is a JSON object. Now, we've already seen several JSON objects that we've dealt with when we've taken a look at the International Space Station. And we could go up here and take a look at, excuse me, that data here. And again, this is Firefox, and I'm not a huge fan of Firefox's presentation of this information, but one of the things is it sort of leaves out, if I was to do the raw data, it gives it to you in this format here, but it doesn't break it out nicely like Google Chrome does with that JSON viewer plugin. However, with the raw data, we can clearly see what information is important. In fact, if I was to click on headers, this is going to be our HTML information. So back to the raw data. So could I simply just copy this? And you'll notice every key is a string and every key is enclosed with inside double quotes in JSON. So if I copy this and I come back over to my interactive interpreter and I just say new and then a big D for new dictionary, and then we'll paste that in and I hit enter. Now when I say new D, you can see that we have this new dictionary. And once again, all of the double quotes have been casted here to single quotes. Now you're going to see something similar to this when we grow our object and we start to take a look at the other JSON data types or the primitives that JSON can work with. So let's go ahead and let's dive in to the next example. So we've talked about the object. We have seen how JSON uses strings and only strings for the names. And those strings have to be enclosed in double quotes. However, on the right-hand side of the colon, we can have any of the other JSON data types. In other words, I could put, as we've seen, a JSON object. And the next data type we're going to talk about is the JSON array. And we've seen that we've had the array in there. And similar to Python, and this is a JSON array. Now, Python is going to refer to that as a list. Now, in JSON, could I mix and match data types in here? In other words, could I do something like this in JSON? And this is going to fall into our certain things. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. So let's copy this and let's see if we come back over to our JSON lint and let's check it out and find out if in fact that's considered valid JSON. And it absolutely is considered valid JSON. However, as I just commented, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And best practice in JSON is not to mix JSON data types inside of the array, even though, as you've seen here, we can get away with that. So this is one place where when we're looking at what a pure definition of an array would be in JavaScript or in maybe the C programming language, where everything in the array needs to be of the same data type, that is advice that we should follow with the JSON array, is that we should keep it the same data type and not leverage it as a list in Python. And again, we're not actually going to be creating a lot of JSON in the course, but this is going to help us understand how to consume this information. So that's basically the array. Again, the JSON array just looks like a Python list, and we access the elements in the array once we've consumed it with Python, just like we would a normal list. If I was to come back over here, and you can see we have our original dictionary D, and let's make sure that that's still intact, and it is. So if I was to say D, and then let's give the key name my cool array, because again, this was in JSON where we called it my cool array, and JSON is going to be a list in Python. If I was to hit enter right now, we would get the value back that that key refers to, which is the array, which is the list 1, 2, 3. Now, what if I want to access the elements? Well, I need to do nothing more than recall that same command, my cool array, and we use our index positions. So if I said -1, that's going to give me the last element of that array, of that list, 1, 2, 3. And as you can see, it's even sort of tongue-tying me at times where you want to say array or list. And so trying to remember where you're at. And when we're talking in the JSON context, it's an array. In the Python context, it's a list. And so now let's look at one example of Booleans. And so if I was to actually come back over here to the MapQuest route get from the directions API, you can see that JSON supports Booleans as well. Does it have a toll road? False. Are there unpaved roads? False. Is there a highway? False on whatever this route is here. Now, what do we notice about the spelling? It's all lowercase. And again, here's another significant difference between Python and JSON. We've seen that Python will support the single quotes for the key names. JSON will not with its strings that are being used as key names. And when we look at the JSON Boolean values of true and false, and the same is true of null as well, they're all lowercase. So this probably is leading you to ask the question, well, if that is true, that in JSON, null and false and true, and specifically we're talking about true and false here, for the Boolean values are all lowercase, how does that work in Python? Well, let's take a look at how that might work. We simply come back over here to brackets, and let's go ahead and add in another key value pair. And we're just simply going to put a key in here, and we're going to make this key Cisco is awesome, and that's going to be our key, and the value is going to be true. And so now we have this last key value pair inside of our JSON object using true with all lowercase letters, because in JSON it needs to be all lowercase. But if we grab this and let's validate it, let's make sure that this JSON data is valid before we try to pull it in as a Python dictionary, and let's click validate JSON, and you can see it is true that this is valid JSON. So I can simply copy this JSON data, and I'm going to step right over here to the interactive interpreter, and I'm going to put in, and let's just say last dictionary with a capital D, and we'll paste that information in, and I'll hit enter, and take a look at what happened. It comes back and it gives me this error because we're cutting and pasting the data in. Whereas before, when we cut and pasted the data in, the double quotes got automatically changed to single quotes. Here, that is not going to happen. However, when we're running scripts, and let me go ahead and step over to my secure CRT window here. When we're running scripts, and I believe I've got a number in here, what happens is, and let's take a look at JSON 4. And now that you guys have advanced so far in the course, all of what you see here probably makes a whole bunch of sense. We're importing URL lib.parse because you guys know we're going to be using the MapQuest API here, and we're going to need to encode some key value pairs, right? This Python dictionary here, which would be a JSON object. And what I'm going to do is at the end here, you can see we print out the URL, we print some data out, but let me go ahead and VI this file, and let's change this so that, and actually, I think I actually have this file already copied here. Let me open recents. It should show up. Yeah, MapQuest demo. So here's what that same file looks like in our interactive interpreter. And you can see at the very end here, I'm printing the JSON data out. And so here is one of the things that you see right here with this JSON method, right? When we create this variable name, JSON underscore data, that's going to be assigned the value of our HTTP GET request to the MapQuest URL, and we want to get that data in JSON format. Let's see what that JSON data looks like when we do it like this. Instead of cutting and pasting where Python is not changing that to a capital T, what's going to happen when we run this file here. So let's put a starting location in of Santa Rosa, California, and Crofton, Maryland. Now, in the interactive interpreter, all we need to do here is double click, and it will open everything up for us in terms of those lines that it had collapsed for brevity. And take a look at what has happened. Has toll road true? Has bridge true? And the T in true has been changed to a capital T, and the F in false has been changed to a capital F. And this, again, is simply an example of casting, or you could think of it as like typecasting, right? Where that JSON method knows that I'm pulling in a bunch of JSON data, and in that data, we may be seeing true and false Boolean JSON data types. We need to account for that. And what we need to do is we need to change that first letter to a capital letter so that when we consume that information, that Python understands what that information is. So we've talked about the object, we've talked about the string, we looked at numbers, we looked at Booleans. The final one is null, and null is very simple. And I want you to remember when we're talking about null, that it does need to be all lowercase, but it literally means no value, right? And this is very different from undefined. If you're a JavaScript programmer, you may see where you'll get a message that says variable undefined. And that means that the variable hasn't been created, right? And in null in JSON, null in JSON means that there is no value. That it's defined, it's just that there isn't a value, right? Whereas in JavaScript, if you're trying to access an object or a variable that is not defined, it's going to come back and tell you undefined. So if that variable or object doesn't exist, it's going to tell you undefined, right? And that's not what null is. Null is saying that, yeah, we've got something that's defined, it's just has no value. And so let's take a look at an example. Maybe an example here is going to make a little bit more sense. And so let's go ahead and we'll add one more line on here. And here is our key value pair. And let's say for null, and I'm trying to think of here, let's just say, toll roads. And that's going to be our name in this name value pair. And we're going to say null. Right? Now, we're not saying false. There's no value there. It just means there's no value there. So let's copy this and let's confirm that this is actually legitimate JSON formatted data. And let's validate our JSON. And in fact, you can see toll roads is null. It just means it's not true and it's not false. It means that there's no value, that it's just not defined yet. And again, maybe you define it at some point. So let's grab all of this and let's see what happens over here in the interactive interpreter. And here I'll do it, let's see, I think I've got to do it right here. So we'll just say lowercase d and we'll paste all of that in. And as you might expect, we get that same error. So let me do this here real quickly. And I'll do it over here in brackets. And I will change the true to t because I was trying to highlight something else, and that's null. So let's copy that again, and let's rerun this here. And let's just simply say d, and we'll paste our value in. You can see here it says name null not defined. Well, what if we were to make that a capital N? Is that going to make a difference? Let's grab all that information. And let's I keep going between the windows. Let's go back here and we'll say D, and then we'll paste everything in. And we'll hit enter, and it says name error, name null not defined. And so here's where, with Python, we run into an instance where null is not going to be accepted, whether it's uppercase or lowercase, right? Now, could we put quotes around that? We absolutely could. So you could have quotes around it, but then it would be treating it as a string, right? And so just be aware of that. All right, well, that is going to wrap up this introduction to JavaScript object notation, or JSON. We covered quite a bit of ground. We looked at objects, we looked at strings, numbers, Booleans, arrays, we looked at the null value, and specifically in the Booleans, we were interested in true and false. And so we saw a lot of the different semantics that take place when working with JSON and what the JSON data might look like, but when we consume that data, what it's going to look like on the Python side. And then we saw how we would work with that once it's incorporated into some kind of a Python dictionary object. All right. Again, hopefully this is a little bit more fluid in terms of the description and the definitions and the examples that were run, and it's going to give you a little bit better idea as to what JSON is, how we consume it, and what it looks like through the Python lens. All right, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you on Thursday evening. Have a great rest of your weekend.